It begins without gunfire, no sirens, no screaming headlines. Just a folded newspaper resting on a cafe table in Harlem, April 15, 1931. Its edges damp from a spilled cup of black coffee that has already gone cold. Outside, the street smells of rain and coal smoke. Inside, men speak quietly if they speak at all. Imagine this for a moment. What kind of warning doesn't announce itself? What kind of threat moves so carefully that you only realize it has arrived when it's already too late to stop it? That morning, something irreversible is set in motion, not by a mob war, not by a public execution, but by restraint, by silence, by a decision made in a narrow window of time in a city where power usually screams to be heard. This is not the story the newspapers printed. This is the version whispered years later after the fear had settled, after the lesson had been learned. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as you listen, leave a comment telling us your local time and where you're watching from. Power always travels farther than we expect. By 1931, Bumpy Johnson had already learned the most dangerous lesson in New York survival was not about how fast you pulled a trigger, but how rarely you needed to. He was 36 years old that spring. Harlem knew his face. So did the booking clerks at Ward's Island, where he had already served multiple sentences. The statistics tell part of it between 1917 and 1930. Harlem recorded more than 1,200 violent arrests linked to organized crime, yet fewer than 8% led to long-term convictions. Bumpy had memorized those odds the hard way. On April 10, 1931, 5 days before the warning began to move, he sat in a brownstone apartment on West 136th Street, a narrow room with a single window and a radiator that clicked like a nervous clock. A notebook lay confiscated on the table, taken earlier that week from a runner who had talked too freely downtown. Bumpy did not open it immediately. He let it sit. Silence again doing the work. The Italians had money. Numbers operations downtown were pulling in an estimated $20 million a year citywide by the early 1930s, and Harlem's slice of that pie was no longer small enough to ignore. For months, intermediaries had pressed gently, then less gently, then not gently at all. Here is the part never written cleanly. Bumpy did not want war. War brought police pressure, broken alliances, and bodies that demanded explanations. He wanted equilibrium, fear carefully distributed like weight on a scale. A man across from him, older, cautious, stirred sugar into his coffee without drinking it. The spoon rattled once, then stopped. That sound mattered. It told Bumpy the room understood what was coming. By choosing restraint first, he forced the next move onto someone else. And once that happened, the chain could no longer be broken. On April 18, 1931, the line was crossed south of Canal Street in a second-floor office above a textile importer that did not import textiles anymore. The Italians called it a misunderstanding. History would later call it arrogance. Two intermediaries, one from East Harlem, one from Mulberry Bend, met at exactly 2:40 p.m. The timing mattered, so did the location. This was territory overseen quietly but firmly by Italian Mafia interests aligned with the rising commission structure. The room smelled of ink and old paper. A wall calendar still read March. What changed everything was not the threat itself. Threats were common. It was the assumption beneath it. They sent word uptown that afternoon Harlem numbers would be reorganized. No meeting requested, no negotiation offered. Just a sentence delivered through a runner who was told to repeat it exactly and not ask questions. That runner did his job. He carried the message north on the 3rd Avenue L, gripping a folded note he never unfolded. When he arrived near West 135th Street, he handed it over without eye contact. That too mattered. By 1931, New York City police logs recorded an average of 18 gang-related homicides per month. But this threat wasn't violent yet. It was administrative, clinical, the kind that erased men without ever mentioning blood. What the Italians misjudged was Harlem's memory. For decades, black-run operations had survived by understanding where force ended and symbolism began. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than most. You could kill a man and create chaos, or you could leave him alive and create obedience. That night, April 18th, rain slicked the sidewalks. A folded newspaper lay untouched on a stoop. A storefront light flickered, then steadied. Inside a small room, Bumpy listened without interrupting his hand, still his expression unreadable. When the message ended, no response was given. Silence again. But this time it wasn't restraint, it was preparation. Because once a threat is issued publicly, even in whispers, it demands an answer. And whatever answer came next would need to travel downtown without a single word attached to it. The Italians thought they had spoken last. They were wrong. The warning did not take the shape anyone expected. On April 21, 1931, just after 6 a.m., a man walked out of a tenement near West 129th Street carrying nothing that looked like a weapon. He wore a clean coat. His shoes were polished but worn thin at the heel. In his pocket was a name and an address written once, then memorized, then destroyed. This was the first link in the chain. By that week, New York's underworld economy was staggering under pressure. Police raids had increased 27% compared to 1929, driven by prohibition enforcement and political optics. Everyone was nervous. Everyone was watching for overreactions. That was the opening. The man took the subway downtown. No tail, no rush. At 8:17 a.m., he entered a bakery near Mulberry Street and ordered coffee he didn't drink. He waited exactly 9 minutes. Then he left behind a small object on the counter, a folded slip of paper blank on both sides. That was the second link. The paper meant nothing by itself, but by noon it had been noticed by the right eyes because it was left in the wrong place at the wrong time by the wrong man. By late afternoon, a trusted associate of Lucky Luciano was quietly informed that something uptown had shifted. Not violence, not betrayal, something colder. A reminder. Here's the detail people argued about later that same evening. A numbers collector connected to Italian operations was found unharmed, but shaken in a hallway near East 116th Street. His ledger was gone, his cash untouched. He was told only one thing before being released: go home. No threats, no signatures. In 1931, an estimated 65% of organized crime income in New York flowed through numbers and gambling, not guns. Touch the money too hard and war followed. Touch the confidence and men corrected themselves. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson stood at a window watching the streetlights come on one by one. Someone behind him asked if it was enough. He didn't answer right away, because the warning wasn't finished yet. A message like this had to land, and landing took patience. By April 24, 1930, the silence had reached downtown. Not as panic, not as rage, as calculation. In a back room off Mott Street, men associated with Italian Mafia gathered without calling it a meeting. No one sat at the head of the table. Coffee cups cooled untouched. A single window remained open despite the chill letting in the sound of streetcars and footsteps, proof the city was still moving, indifferent to their problem. Someone read from memory. No paper, no names, just facts. A runner released without harm. A ledger missing but no money taken. No retaliation, no demand. That absence was the message. Statistics mattered here. In 1931, fewer than 1 in 10 mob-related disputes escalated into open warfare, but nearly 70% ended after a symbolic act established dominance without bloodshed. The Italians understood the math. They had built empires on it. What unsettled them was authorship. Warnings usually came signed in bullets or bodies. This one came with restraint, with discipline, with an understanding of optics that suggested patience, and patience implied confidence. One man finally spoke, quietly. He said Harlem was testing the room, not threatening it, testing it. And here is the human detail. People remember a senior figure folded his napkin slowly, precisely as if deciding where to place it. Mattered more than the conversation itself. When he finished, he nodded once. That nod ended the discussion. No order was given, no counterstrike approved. Let me ask you this, because this is where opinions still split decades later. If you were sitting at that table, would you have answered silence with violence or accepted that the warning had already done its work? That night, no cars drove uptown. No men crossed invisible lines. The city breathed tense but intact. In Harlem, word arrived not as celebration, but relief. A barber closed early. A numbers runner counted slower than usual. Bumpy Johnson said nothing. Because the most dangerous phase of power isn't when it's challenged. It's when it's acknowledged. The change in Harlem was not announced. It was felt. By the first week of May 1931, men adjusted their routes without being told to. Numbers runners crossed streets they had avoided for months. Conversations in back rooms grew shorter, then calmer. Fear didn't disappear, it reorganized itself. Police records from that spring show something subtle but telling. Gambling-related arrests in Upper Harlem dropped by 14% over 3 weeks, even as activity continued. Fewer disputes, fewer complaints, less noise. That kind of order never came from peace, it came from clarity. Bumpy Johnson noticed it in small ways. A man who used to speak too fast now paused before answering. Another avoided eye contact, not out of disrespect but caution. Power once recognized did not need reinforcement. One afternoon near West 135th Street, Bumpy stood outside a storefront, hands in his coat pockets. A folded newspaper lay on a crate nearby, the headline about an unrelated shooting downtown. He didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. The story he cared about wasn't printed. Here's the rumor people argued about later, that a downtown intermediary quietly advised his superiors to leave Harlem as it is. No threats, no apologies, just a suggestion framed as wisdom. In that world, suggestions carried weight only when backed by fear. This was the transformation. Before April, Bumpy had been a man you dealt with. After April, he was a variable you planned around. And this raises another question, one still debated in corners where history is remembered instead of written. Is power more frightening when it explodes, or when it proves it can stop just short? The warning had worked precisely because it did not escalate. No bodies forced retaliation, no blood demanded revenge. The Italians adjusted, Harlem stabilized. That night, Bumpy sat alone, listening to the city through an open window. Somewhere a radio played softly. Somewhere else a door closed gently. No victory speech followed, no celebration, just the quiet knowledge that something fragile had held. And that fragility, maintained by discipline rather than force, was what made it last. Years later, people struggled to explain what had really happened in the spring of 1931. There was no crime scene to photograph, no trial transcript to quote, no obituary that captured the shift. What remained were behaviors. By the end of that year, internal police summaries noted that major territorial disputes involving Harlem dropped to near zero, even as organized gambling revenue in the city continued to climb past $30 million annually. Power had not vanished, it had settled. Men who had once spoken of Harlem as a prize now spoke of it as a condition, something fixed, something better left undisturbed. The warning had not rewritten the rules, it had reminded everyone which rules already existed. The story survived the way most dangerous truths do, imperfectly. Some said the message was more elaborate. Others insisted it was simpler than anyone realized. A few claimed nothing happened at all, that fear invented the meaning afterward. But everyone agreed on one detail. After April 1931, nobody tested Harlem the same way again. On certain evenings, old-timers would point to a street corner and fall quiet. Not because something happened there, but because something didn't. Silence became evidence. Absence became proof. Bumpy Johnson never corrected the stories. He let them blur, let them contradict each other. Myth was safer than clarity. Myth traveled farther. The final image people remember isn't violent, it's small. A man standing at a window as night comes on, streetlights flickering awake, the city breathing uneasy but intact. History often celebrates explosions. It rarely honors restraint. Yet sometimes the most enduring power is the kind that proves it doesn't need to be used. No monument marks that warning. No plaque explains it. Just a quiet understanding that once existed and for a time held. History is fragile, not because it breaks easily, but because it survives selectively. We remember the gunshots because they are loud. We remember the bodies because they demand accounting. But the moments that truly change direction, the ones shaped by hesitation, restraint, and choice, often leave no visible scar. What happened in Harlem in 1931 did not end violence. It did not purify power. It did something more human and more unsettling. It demonstrated that fear could be calibrated, that authority could be asserted without spectacle, that silence used carefully could outweigh noise. For the people who lived through it, the lesson lingered long after the names blurred. They remembered how quickly confidence could shift, how a single decision made in a narrow window of time could spare lives or at least delay their loss. And perhaps that is why this story endures the way it does, not as a headline, not as a chapter, but as a feeling passed from one voice to another, a warning remembered not for what it destroyed, but for what it prevented. In the end, history is not only what happened, it is what almost happened and didn't.